Hey guys, Nate here with the Volunteer Tech Vlog. Greetings, students of audio video technology. In today's Volunteer Tech Vlog audio lesson, we'll be talking about dynamic range, or should I say dynamic range. Oh, that was really bad. Probably can't even hear the dynamic range between the two phrases I just said with all the road noise in the background. And by the way, think of road noise as our noise floor. So we'll get into that in a minute. But I just wanted to give a quick shout out before we get going here to Ian Shepherd. He is a mastering engineer, I believe out of the UK. And he set up this whole movement online called Dynamic Range Day, which just so happens to be occurring on March 27th, 2015. So if you are interested in hearing his perspective on dynamic range and why it's important, you may want to check out Dynamic Range Day. Just Google it. I'll put a link in the description of this video. Now when he's talking about dynamic range, what he's talking about is a dynamic range of an album. So he does mastering engineering, and so he's talking about CDs, or, I believe Red Book standard audio CDs, and the dynamic range of such discs. And that is really a digital dynamic range, or an electrical, an observed electrical dynamic range that, occurs on a CD when you put it into a system. So what we're talking about here is loudness wars. So there has been a trend over the last 10, 15 years or so where bands and mastering engineers, actually I'm not quite sure who to necessarily pin it on. I think it might just be more of a trend in the overall industry where people want to have the loudest album out there. And louder, for a long time, this notion that louder is better was going around different CD production houses and people that are in charge of such decisions. And so what we're talking about is they would try to compress the dynamic range. So basically try to extinguish the dynamic range so that there was no fluctuation in levels over time, so that everything was just cranking, like right at the peak, right below clipping, so that the album was as loud as possible. And that's what people were after, so that when you put a CD into your system, it was going to be noticeably louder than the previous CD that you put in there, because that, one that was produced with no dynamic range, the level could be bumped up all the way to the ceiling, and it would be perceived as louder than maybe some other CDs that you may be listening to. So now there's been an about face. There's been a change, and people are starting to appreciate that dynamics are an important thing. And if you study music at all, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you have studied sheet music and you play in an ensemble, in an orchestra, in a concert band, in a jazz ensemble, dynamics are a huge thing. You need to know how loud you are relative to everybody else. And you may have, piano written on in the dynamic section of your sheet music, and piano means you're going to play softly. You may have mezzo forte written on your sheet music, and that means you're going to play a little bit louder, moderately. And then you might have forte or forte, or and so on. There's all these different Italian terms that have been adopted to describe dynamics. So that is one form of dynamics. So we've talked about dynamic range in a CD. We've talked about dynamic range within an orchestra or an orchestral ensemble. And now there's also another type of dynamic range. So acoustic. So there's the electrical dynamic range of your system, and there's also the acoustic dynamic range of your system. So dynamic range is a term that can apply to various different things in music, and it is one of the characteristics of sound. And we're talking about levels, our peaks and valleys. A quick definition of dynamic range would be the difference between the quietest portion in a song and the loudest portion. So that is going to be your dynamic range. It will be measured in dB. Now, sometimes the quietest portion of your song gets obscured, gets kind of stepped on by what we call the noise floor. So the noise floor is the softest possible volume that your system can produce, right? So if you had no signal going into your system and you cranked it up, you might hear like a hissing, like a or something like that. And basically at that point, you've got nothing coming through your system and you've cranked it up. What you're hearing then is the noise floor. So that is the softest possible what should I say, level that your system can produce. So that is really part of the definition, you know, that kind of alters the definition. So I had just said that the dynamic range is the difference in dB between the quietest portion of program audio and the loudest portion of program audio. Now depending on your noise floor, the definition needs to be altered to say, really, the dynamic range is the difference in dB between the noise floor and the loudest portion of program audio. So those are different ways you should start to think about the dynamic range if you haven't already thought about it. I hope you have found this little volunteer tech vlog audio lesson helpful. Definitely check out the links below. Like I said, check out Dynamic Range Day if you're interested in learning more about that. There's a pretty cool video for Dynamic Range Day. I'll put in the cards to this YouTube video. YouTube is starting to roll out this new thing called cards in place of annotation. So anyway, that wraps it up for this video. My name is Nate. Thanks for watching.